That old man river, I want you to know he keeps on rolling along.
The constancy of the river is a common impression for songwriters, travelers, and anyone pondering the Mississippi. When we enter Louisiana from Arkansas at Lake Gasaway, that impression swells. The first signs of work here are the lush pepper fields of Panola pepper sauce. Though they call this the poorest part of the state, some signs remind us not to judge it by economic numbers. Lake Providence is rich in just the sort of beautifully faded landmarks we've come here to see. In the Delta, wind-worn landmarks stare you down.
At its peak, Mound was the home to 500 tenant farmers who planted and worked the land. The store provided everything. The people even had their own currency. The post office was closed after 70 years because postal regulations said liquor could not be served in a building which also handled the mail. From one of our series references, Louisiana Proud, by Andy Smith. This, of course, is Mound and the Mound Plantation store, a good starting point for a journey that you and I will now make, which will take us all the way south to New Orleans. I'm Jeff Duay. This is our latest search for lost Louisiana. Rivers run deep. This is the Mississippi.
In the Delta, wind-worn landmarks not only stare you down, they make you look back further than the Old South, longer than the Europeans, almost as far back as the current course of Old Man River. We're trespassing now on the home of the mound builders. In the 1840s, an explorer looking for lead first reported native artifacts in this area, but it wasn't until the 1950s when geologists took a second look at a 20-year-old aerial photo that our generation realized something big was here long, long before. Surprise, a man-made shape so big you can't see it from the ground. Since then, scientists have worked here trying to figure out who these people were. We know they left this corner of Louisiana 3,300 years ago. We are still examining the earthen ridges, the mounds, and all the much smaller things they left behind. Geologist Roger Saucier.
I guess we'll probably never know exactly why Poverty Point people settled exactly where they did. I have a feeling that that is probably largely a matter of socioeconomics or perhaps a socio-political factor. But obviously the Poverty Point peoples liked the margins of the ridges like Mason Ridge. This has afforded them high ground, relatively immune from flooding, with good arable soils and good locations for living conditions.
A C-shaped figure dominates the Poverty Point site at nearby Epps. The outermost ridges are nearly 3/4 of a mile wide. The ends of the interior 594 meters apart. If these were straightened, they would be 12 kilometers long. Park Service Manager Dennis Labatt.
Mound A, or the Bird Mound as some refer to it, is singly one of the largest features that these people constructed while they were here. Today it rises about 72 feet in the air, would measure about 600 by 800 feet at its base. If you take these figures, translate that into cubic yards, you're looking at over 300,000 in its construction. And then if we took that figure and translated it into 50-pound baskets, you're looking at well over 10 million that went in this one mound alone. That's pretty impressive. See the bird-shaped mound that we have here, you'd have to be about 1,000 feet in the air. It's truly that large. Looking here into the stairs, you'd see the middle of the bird's back and then breaking out equally to the north and to the south, representing the wings. As you'd almost see this again, flying away from the concentric terraces into the west, and it is on an east-west axis, so it's very carefully laid out.
Scientists conclude their society was a sophisticated one with trade routes and exploration throughout the South. What faded landmarks we can still find here show that this corner of modern Louisiana, Mississippi, and Arkansas was an important cradle of Native American society. Some people whiz by on I-20 through Delta to Vicksburg. You and I will be taking a road less traveled. We wouldn't want to miss beautiful Crescent Plantation, just a mile from the superhighway. Built in 1832 by Dr. D.M. and Elizabeth Dancy, it's still a working farm. It was saved from the Yankees' torch because a sickly woman inside could not or would not be moved. Scout around Delta and you'll uncover one of the Civil War's great forgotten follies. This wide ditch is all that's left of Grant's Canal. In 1862, Vicksburg was holding up against the Union's advance until the food completely ran out. No less than General Ulysses Grant desperately wanted to uncork their river blockade, and his scheme was to cut a huge ditch. Maybe the water would scour a new course and let northern commerce through. To dig it, he used captured slaves from the plantations near here. The strongest had fled with their masters. These were the aged and house helpers. They dug that winter and failed and tried again with drag lines. In the spring, Confederates pelted these rigs with cannonballs. The mighty Union Army thought it could change the course of the river. The river wanted to be tamed about as much as did the people of Vicksburg. It dumped only mud in Grant's ditch, and the Yanks finally gave up. All that remains is this long pit through the town of Delta. This is where Teddy Roosevelt hunted the Louisiana black bear. It would be illegal today, but the teddy bear was inspired by his trip to the Caney Breaks along this stretch of our river. The historic markers are plentiful along Highway 65 South. A cluster of graves in Somerset mourns the richest family in these parts, a planter named Perkins. His son has the saddest marker for the tragic story it tells. He's not buried here. He's still in the Arctic, it seems, lost at sea in 1854, erected by his bereaved father in Somerset. Here the river has left behind dozens of oxbow lakes on both sides of the state border. The French explorer La Salle camped here in 1682. Here some Newellton high schoolers reenact their town's brush with a pivotal moment in history when the Tensaw Indians helped the white man through misleading channels.
The strange man's lips moved with no sound, and he clasped and unclasped his hands, making symbols and raising them towards the heavens. The Tensaw people were very proud people, and they worshiped the sun god, so they basically thought La Salle was a sun god because his skin was so bright.
I think that this is a wonderful opportunity for them to study the history of Tensaw Parish, and by participating in it, I think that they will always remember what they've learned. I think that this day will be one day they will recall as being one of the fun days of their high school years.
Without supplies and advice from the Tensaw, La Salle certainly would not have paddled further south and wouldn't have claimed all this for France. More about staking claims later in our journey. For now, it's back to the Civil War and another house spared the Yankee torches.
Architecturally, it's very unique, studied in a lot of different classes. You've got a log cabin, an Acadian-style house built onto it, and then a Greek Revival style built on. And then the last edition, the bathroom, 1855, doesn't match any of the styles. And it was a working plantation. A lot of times when you think of plantations, you've got the pretty, pristine, fancy things like Tara and Gone with the Wind. But this was more of a working plantation.
Winter Quarters is tucked away from Big Highway 65. It began in 1805 as a hunting lodge. As a state park historic house, it waits for the adventurous traveler on the south side of Lake St. Joseph. Kathy Tarver will show you around. Dr. Haller Nutt bought it in 1850 and was building a grander place on the other side of the river when war broke out.
He did own quite a few plantation homes. He was not your typical plantation owner because he did a lot of agricultural research and genetic research within the cotton production.
He was building a house, a much bigger house across the river, right?
Longwood Plantation is probably what you're talking about. It was a 6-story, beautiful mansion built similar to almost like the Taj Mahal. It has the dome like the Taj Mahal. And it started just before the war. And when the war started, the builders were all from the north. So they were afraid that they'd be trapped down here, so they left, and so the building was never finished. Haller died in 1864. Julia moved back to Longwood, and that's where she lived for the rest of her days. And she lived in that house knowing she could never fulfill her husband's dream. And that, to me, had to have been real hard to finish my days in that house. I couldn't finish.
Today we think Dr. Nutt a Union sympathizer. If that's true, we can thank his politics that this gem stands today. News of the Union's advance was met with horror just south at Pleasant View Plantation. The mistress, a Mrs. Bondurant, deprived the invaders of 100 bales of cotton ready for market. She burned them all. Through mighty Army Corps of Engineers efforts to convince the Mississippi not to change its mind and swoosh down the Atchafalaya. Draw your own comment here on who will, albeit not in our lifetimes, who will eventually win. Constancy on the mind always along this river, in new roads. Just yards away from the bank of False River in Point Coupee Parish, a small museum waits for visitors. The flags of Bourbon France and Castilian Spain declare to any passers-by on Highway 1, this is a rich cultural stop. Melta Poissieu is one of the volunteers who will tell you just how rich in lore this spot is. To lovers of Louisiana history, it's near sacred ground, close to where the great explorer Iberville and his hardy band of French Canadians walked just over 300 years ago. Glenn Morgan is an architect in New Roads. He's drawn a series of fanciful and detailed maps and storylines for educating visitors to the Point Coupee Museum about the great trek French explorers made through these parts.
He was going from the south to the north and portaged over a small neck of land, bypassing this enormous 22-mile bend on the river, largest one in the Mississippi system, okay? And
he was lucky to have a good relation with the Indians who told him that.
Oh, yes. They were on the way to another Indian village. And basically, it's because he was trying to prove the fact that he was on the Mississippi, okay?
Well, do you find that even here in Point Coupee, people know about the story of these tremendous folks, you know, that they know the great human drama that was played here? People don't really know.
That's why we like to tell the story.
Just over 300 years ago, Pierre Lemoyne Sieur d'Iberville was anchored off Ship Island, far to the east, past Bay St. Louis. He had 3 ships, but they were too large to take him any further west on his mission to verify the mouth of the Mississippi River. He was skipping along the coast, finding friendly natives, and always asking them, where in all this swamp can I find the great river that leads all the way to Canada? LSU professor Richard Condrey is an avid fan of the detailed journals Iberville kept.
It was a hard life. They had disease on board. When they were on the river several times, you know, Iberville would say, well, this was a really hard day because I've had a fever. They were often living on Indian corn. Every now and then they would get from the Indians some dried bison meat or some deer. or be able to kill a bear, or be able to kill a deer. In fact, I think it was near Point Coupé that they shot a deer as it was crossing the river, swimming across the river, and they feasted on it that night.
They crossed the marshes. They rode through passages only the Indians could show them. The natives knew this watery realm for hundreds of years. And unlike other Europeans, the French had a sophisticated rapport with the Indians.
It seemed to be a rather peaceful experience for them, okay? There were really no hostilities on the first run along with the Indians that they met. In other words, the Indians seemed to offer peace, and the expedition seemed to offer peace.
Theirs was actually no great discovery, but it was a great claim for France. Spanish galleons had sniffed the Mississippi's tides back in 1519. De Soto touched it near Memphis in 1541. La Salle reached its mouth from Canada 17 years before Iberville. When La Salle got lost, a fellow Canadian named Tonty came down the river after him. Tonty left a letter for La Salle with an Indian tribe. La Salle didn't live to read the letter. 300 years ago, Iberville's younger brother did.
He sends his brother Bienville and the rest of the men on downstream. And when they get to the village of the Bayou Gula, the chief has been with them, and he now no longer suspects that they might be Spanish, but understands that the connection with French and with La Salle. And he tells them that he had not given them this letter from Tonty to La Salle, but he was giving it to them now.
Sure, because Tonty, who had come looking for La Salle years before, had left this letter with the Indians, and they knew that Tonty, that explorer, had come all the way from Canada down the Mississippi, so they made the connection with that evidence. So he knew
that was the Mississippi. And he brings that with him and gives it to his brother when they arrive on the same day at Ship Island.
When they rejoined.
When they rejoined, just ironically on the same day. He was also a scientist. The French at the time were on an international first mission. They were on a mission to measure the shape of the globe of the planet.
This is one of the great stages in a more than 300-year-old drama. Miss Melda is waiting to show you around. We'll continue our search for lost Louisiana as rivers run deep. This is the Mississippi.
That old man river, he must know something. The man don't say nothing.
Oscar Hammerstein got one thing wrong in his dirgeful lyrics for Showboat. Old Man Rivers says plenty with his behavior right about here. The waters tell us about the shape of America as they roll south of Baton Rouge. This is the edge of the continental beach. And the old man shifts into low gear for a final, mournful spread to the Gulf. This is our search for lost Louisiana. Rivers run deep. This is the Mississippi. And this is the capital Huey Long built. Now they're cleaning up the house he built to go with it. There have been many redecorations of the old governor's mansion since 1930. 9 governors lived here, and every first lady added her own style. In the case of plaster molding, coat after coat of style.
And consequently, we got at least, 9 governors, so we got at least 9 coats of paint, and maybe sometimes twice, depending on what the thoughts were. We're in the east room of the old governor's mansion, and the colors that you see right now are the base colors for the faux work that's going to be done in here. The red colors, or the rusty red type colors, is the base color that will be, remember this will be the finished product.
Area of this. In 1930, this looks like a real expensive thing to do. Is that
It was that.
It was.
This was top of the line.
Architect Jerry Campbell has tried to think of everything, even where to locate the air conditioning, so there will be no anachronistic air vents.
Yeah, I like that.
We were able to, in most cases, conceal them, or in a few cases we had to lower the ceiling just in the hallway. You didn't even know that the ceiling was lowered.
The nonprofit Foundation for Historical Louisiana will curate this Georgian mansion. In a deal with the state, they are overseeing dozens of workers tending such delicates as unique French wallpaper. Foundation Director Carolyn Bennett.
It began as a re-roofing project. You know, the most important thing you can do for old buildings is to make sure they don't leak. We wanted to work on this building. That's been our mission, preservation of Baton Rouge's architectural and cultural heritage.
Huey built himself a new governor's mansion. Here it is. The taxpayers were mighty sore about it. They almost impeached him. He replied that the old mansion was not good enough for him, though it had been too good for his predecessors.
In 1930, not long before we sent the Kingfish to Washington as senator, as governor, he was tired of his old mansion and, the stories go, schemed in a typical fashion to get himself a new one.
Huey came in and declared that the building was unfit for human habitation. He said it's full of rats, it's full of termites. He called Angola, had the warden send out trucks. One day they took all the furniture out of the building. The next day they sent another group of men in trucks, and they totally demolished the building in about 2 days. It was gone. From the ground up, it was history.
So at that point, the legislature has no choice, but...
They have to have a place for the governor to live, so they built a new building.
That's a classic Huey story.
And a classic Huey story. This is the governor's bedroom. Of course, the first he occupied was Huey alone himself. All the other 9 governors, this was the governor's bedroom. See, this is Huey's bathroom, and it's in the greens, of course, which was his favorite color. We were missing a few appliances in here, like the commode. And a lot of the bathrooms, we're not sure where they went, but they just disappeared. When we got here, they were gone, so we're not sure what time they left.
But turquoise and orange peel?
Orange peel or peach color, yeah.
You know that it was his choice.
Yes. Miss Weiss, the architect's wife, had a lot to do with the colors and picking the furniture, I think. So I'm pretty sure this is Huey's choice. Knowing his demeanor and how strong this man was, he had a lot to do with the colors, I would think.
Yeah.
19,000 square feet, a sunroom, servants' quarters, 9 bedrooms at least, each with a bath, private study adjacent to staff rooms, and quarters for personal bodyguards. You wonder what this might cost on today's real estate market. The restoration will top $2 million.
We have been getting some telephone calls in our offices. People have items in their family's possession that have the aura of being in this governor's mansion. We also are very interested in people coming forward if they have oral histories, stories about this mansion. Who were some of the people who were entertained here, what events took place. It was the home of the first family for about 32 years, 9 governors. We want to capture those memories, and now's the time because these people are getting quite old.
But for its address along the timeline of history, this one has that location. Let's cross the river to the west one last time. The man who sang Walking to New Orleans was born right here. Fats Domino spent his first 4 years in a small house near this much grander one. This is Laura Plantation in Vacherie. 10 years ago, it stood in abject ruin. Now, Norman Marmillon and his wife have miraculously rescued it and tend it respectfully.
Well, the architects took drawings of it in '91, told me about it in '92. We came here in '93, and we got our hands on it, and they told us we had 8 months before it collapsed.
Really?
We had 12 buildings out here, this being the biggest house. But we're restoring even the small houses and things like the well back there and the other houses. But we had to do a lot of painting, and we had to restore a lot of the columns down here. And it's a 12-year program. We have 12 buildings out here that we're putting back together.
But what had to be done every day?
This, on a plantation, is very regimented. It's almost like boot camp. You get up at 3 o'clock in the morning to go to work. When the sun rises, then you get breakfast. And no matter how old you are, children 6 to 12 years of age had their chores to do every day. They had to bring breakfast to all the workers. By bringing breakfast, I mean you carry 2 big heavy buckets filled with milk and butter and clabber or cottage cheese, and you walk 3.5 miles and deliver that, for people who are working here. So it was very structured. There were classes even of slaves on the plantation. This whole plantation is structured into cubicles, 30 different cubicles, because there's 30 different jobs to do in a plantation in the course of a year. The plantation is color-coded because the workers cannot read and write, and so a building would be painted a certain color so they'll know this is what you do in this spot, and the other, you don't do that. So, well, it's a business. This is a huge business, and these businesses became mega businesses. They would merge small farms into bigger plantations. So by the 1850s and 60s, these are mega businesses. That's why you have more millionaires in this area between Baton Rouge and New Orleans than you have in the rest of the country combined at that time. So these are the big multinational corporations 125, 140 years ago.
This outbuilding from 1829 was the retirement home for the family manager. It was also a Civil War hospital, then a barn for yams until the 30s. What a sight along the river road in Vacherie.
Travel the west bank of the river and you'll find many examples of how the modern is replacing the nearly forgotten. That's the Veterans Memorial Bridge linking Gramercy to the west bank here in Wallace. And its approaches and exits nearly took out this beautiful old example of one of the early houses of the German and French settlers to this coast. It has an extended kitchen, as you can notice, and in fact a dog trot area where you could go back and forth between the house and the kitchen. On a personal note, I simply can't forget this house because this was my great-grandfather Scheckschneider's place in Wallace.
Willie Robert will not let his old home fall to ruin when someone broke into his family's 1814 Creole-style house and set it on fire. He just couldn't surrender his history.
This is a Creole cottage, and you can tell that by the way the roof is designed. It has a Norman truss roof, which is what? Indicative of his age. It's a 12-foot king post going up, and it has 2 diagonal braces coming down on either side to support it. A lot of my friends said, "Man, why don't you just knock it down? Forget about it." I said, "Well, there's only about 6 left in this area like this," and I said, "Well, I made a promise to my aunt that I would keep it in good condition as long as I could, and I'm just living up to my end of the deal."
Robert has worked bit by bit and spent perhaps $50,000 to restore the Dugas house to livability.
The whole house is pegged together. The only thing that was nailed was the end of the rafters and the shingles. Everything else is pegged together.
It's a remarkable effort along the river road where too many descendants have let too much go already.
There's not that many left to pick up on, and like I said, that's why I didn't let it go. I mean, because I could have easily, I was pretty well disgusted that morning. I could have easily just gone ahead and knocked.
When it burned?
Yeah, when it burned, I mean, it was pretty disturbing.
Why did you rebuild it?
Well, I'm just living up to my end of the deal. And like I said, they don't have that many in the state left.
To the East Bank and Garyville, this was a timber town. Trains and loggers pulled great cypress knees from the swamps between Lakes Marpaw and Pontchartrain. The Stebbins Lumber Company built houses for its workers. It had one set of plans. No matter the passage of time or the remodeling, you can always spot the Stebbins houses by their quaint angle and scale in Garyville. Along the river road in Reserve, we were curious what was going on under a big tarp. They're cleaning up an old locomotive. This was one of the originals used to haul sugar cane by the Gotcho Henderson refinery. But there's only a pile of rubble where Gacho once stood. It had become a liability on a new industrial park for one of the world's largest ports. Seeing the last smokestack of the sugar refinery that once employed half the town at cutting season brings a lump to the throats of the men who worked it. You'll usually find some Gacho sugar veterans sitting outside the American Legion Hall.
The refinery started in 1896. It was only a sugar house, a very small sugar house, and it just, every year they just kept adding and adding till they got to where they were. At the end, we were making over 4 million pounds of sugar.
Nearly every day, someone recalls a story from the factory.
I believe they had a good day's work for a good pay.
I worked during the grinding about 47, 48, 62 cents an hour. That was pretty good money, I guess.
In the field, they would pick the cane up, put it on little cane cars, which they call narrow gauge cane cars, or they would haul by mules, wagons with mules. They would chop the cane up so it'd make it smaller when it would get to the mill, and they would go through a series of rollers that would grind, and squeeze, gradually squeeze all the juice out of the cane.
And then they would spin it into sugar too?
No, that went through a different process. It would have to be boiled in about 4 different stages before it came to, a process of getting white sugar out of it.
This man once sold lunches to workers 7 days a week delivered on his bike. A labor strike provided small-town drama 45 years ago.
Some Yankees came down and shot him some BS, and they believed it. But what it was all about...
You mean the union?
Yeah, but the company offered them 7.5 cents. But they never did tell the membership that they offered them 7.5 cents. They kept telling them they didn't want to even give them a nickel until they turned over the 2 bosses right there by my house over there on that cross street. And they took them to court. That's when they found out they were sold down the river. That's the whole story. Now you can believe what I'm telling you.
When Dudley Beetle was a boy, he rode his bicycle through the sugar refinery. It was such an important landmark to him, he made this model. He enjoys showing it to older workers and watching the memories come rushing back.
How long did you work there, Mr. Garrett?
Well, I started when I was 16.
Yeah.
And I went till I was 60. Till the place closed.
Yeah. They see it and then they start reminiscing. That's what you just saw here a few minutes ago. Yeah. They talk about this and that going on now. It seems like it picks up their morale, They get quite an enjoyment out of it. They talk about it often. And it stirs up a conversation with them.
Mr. Calhoun, do you think that the town was really sad when the...
Oh, sure. It was worse than that, then.
There was a lot of people were sad, I guess.
Mm-hmm. They talk about the steel mills in, Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, or anything like that, all closing down in the 70s and 80s, but we had a real story just like that right here, didn't we?
Right here, right. There's at least 50% of the workers here at that time was 50 years or older, and it was very hard on them because, at 50 years old. And then in the mid-80s, there's very few plants were hiring anybody because they was cutting back. And we just had to scrap here and there until we got the retirement age of security.
Funny the stories you can dig out of an old pile of rubble. Everyone in reserve has some connection to these ruins.
62 cents an hour. That was pretty good money, I guess.
He don't plant potatoes.
After all of us and all of our efforts, we've come to know what will remain. With that finality, we'll pull into New Orleans and bypass the usual stops. You and I are headed for the cities of the dead.
I want you to know they're soon forgotten, but that old...
Tourists most often come to St. Louis Cemetery No. 1 to see the tomb of the witch queen, Marie Laveau. 2 rows over, if they get a good tour guide, they learn about Homer Plessy.
Now, they lost this case at the Supreme Court, and this is really what began the rash of Jim Crow laws, separate but equal laws that would be present here in the South all the way up until 1954. When it was finally
This is his grave. It is unmarked. The inscription that says he died in 1925 is over here, so it won't fall off and break again. Such is often the fate for scant artifacts of lesser-known heroes. Homer Plessy, the New Orleans shoemaker, lies here. Biographer Keith Medley is trying to write a better epitaph for Homer Plessy.
From a personal perspective, I grew up during separate but equal the first few years of my life, and I grew up in the same neighborhoods that they operated from. So when I started digging into this case and I realized all of this stuff happened right where my grandparents lived and where they grew up, that gave it even another dimension for me.
We are climbing.
At the end of the last century, there were a group of citizens, many French-speaking Creoles, well-educated and erudite, who decided to challenge segregation. In July of 1890, the Louisiana legislature passed the Separate Rail Car Act. It demanded railroad companies separate passengers into cars for different races. The only blacks in the white cars were to be porters or black nurses caring for white children.
Homer was active in the benevolent associations that they had in Treme. These associations were set up and they gave medical benefits and burial benefits for their members. So there were many reasons for him to be the test case.
At a downtown corner of Press Street, named for the cotton presses here, you could catch a rail car north over the new 7-mile bridge across Lake Pontchartrain to Covington. Homer Plessy stepped off the East Louisiana Railroad Company platform right here, where only dusty track beds remain. He stepped onto a train and into history.
As the train started inching forward, the conductor came to him and asked him, "Are you a colored man?" And to which Plessy responded, "Yes." The conductor told him that you would have to go into the car set aside for your race. Plessy refused, said he was an American citizen and he intended to ride to Covington. The conductor then stopped the train, called Private Detective C.C. Kane, who came aboard and told Plessy once again that he would have to leave. When he refused, he was dragged off the train 6 blocks away to the 5th precinct station on Elysian Fields in Delphine.
The headline, "A Snuff-Colored Son of Ham," that's a biblical reference for Negro, is taken to jail rather than mind his place.
After the arrest, he came before Judge Ferguson in October of 1892. And then Judge Ferguson ruled against Plessy. And then he came before the Louisiana State Supreme Court, which met in this very room.
We think it a common strategy now to put a law on trial by sending a test case through the courts, but this was one of the first, and it was controversial among blacks. Leaders like Booker T. Washington argued for appeasement. Still, to the U.S. Supreme Court, they forged on.
When he died on March 1st, 1925, I don't think he had any idea that he would ever be redeemed. That same year, the Klan held their biggest rally ever in Washington, D.C., and I think in many ways, people may have blamed him for separate but equal because it was he who brought the case. But in 1954, he was redeemed by Brown versus Board of Education, and in that decision, they used many of the same arguments and tactics that Plessy's lawyers used in Plessy versus Ferguson.
John Howard Ferguson was the original judge. His house still stands on Henry Clay Street. A plaque bears no witness to the Yankee judge's most famous decision that Homer Plessy had no right to sit with whites. There is no Plessy v. Ferguson inscribed here. There is no Plessy versus Ferguson inscribed here either. Only Keith Medley to tell a nearly lost story and to call our attention to these tangible connections as touchstones of lost Louisiana, all these lonely places crowded with memories. Through our Louisiana conscience, the Mississippi will keep on rolling. The moral at the end of our river journey is just what you and I knew it would be when we began